Let's stitch up the Simplicity S9388 jacket pattern. Hello makers, Katherine here from Minerva, and today let's stitch up the Simplicity S9388 jacket pattern. So this is a unisex pattern, and we also have a kit for it, and I will link everything for the kit and what I'm using down below, so do be sure to check that out as well. So let's get into what exactly we're going to need to start this project.
So to start, we have this beautiful denim fabric here and a paper pattern with 3 different views to choose from in 3 different lengths. Now this is a unisex pattern, so it's great for the whole family. We've got some fusible interfacing as well as lining that matches perfectly with this denim, a standard needle, and some warm toned buttons along with matching thread to include.
So now that we've got everything gathered up, you just need to select which view to use. Now there are 3 views. View A, which is a shorter cropped length version. View B, which is what I chose to make, which hits you about mid-thigh. And then view C, which goes down below your knees. So the differences between the different views is basically the length that your jacket is. Now that you've got that all set up, let's get to stitching.
So we're going to begin by prepping the pattern. So this is a tissue paper pattern, and some of the pieces are singles, like the cuffs and things like that, and the pocket pieces. So I use that in the tissue, and I will trace out on tracing paper the rest of the pattern that is in a different size. So to prep this, we are going to put the interfacing on. So this is the top of those front pocket flaps, and we're going to use the fusible side of the interfacing and fuse it to the fabric here. And you're only going to do that on 1/2 of your top flaps. So I'm just going to put that aside for a moment. The other areas that you want to interface is going to be one of the collar pieces and both of your cuff pieces right here, as well as the button placket, and you're going to do both sides. Now for the patch pockets. Now for the patch pockets, we are going to have to fold down the hem. So with this, we're going to fold down 1/4 of an inch just along the top. And then when that's done, we're going to flip it to the right side, and you see that little notch on either side? We're going to fold it right at that notch line, just going across and giving a nice good bit of steam. Then head on over to the sewing machine and stitch using your seam allowance. So make sure to backstitch at the start and the end. And these stitching lines that we're stitching along here are going to help us with our pressing so that we get a nice even press along that pocket. So make sure that your seam allowance is nice and even, paying careful attention to those corners that we have. And so I'm just going up, and it also acts to create that facing on the inside for that pocket on that turn. Okay, so next we have that all stitched in place, and then we can poke out these corners in the pocket here. And I am just using this little awl here to press that out. Press the top of the pocket first to get everything all lined up, and then go around the pocket following along that seam line we just stitched so that you can fold it in. I do the sides first and then the bottom, and it gives a nice fold on here. So the next thing we're going to do, so we're going to stitch all the way across the top to hold that hem in place along the top of the pocket here. And I am back stitching. Now you could stitch this from the front side using a contrasting top stitching thread. So next, let's find the center of our pocket. I'm just going to mark that with chalk right here, and then take out one of your buttons and place that button on here and stitch that in place. Now that we have that for both sides of the pocket, let's head on over to our flaps. So with the flaps, you're going to place one of the interfacing pieces right sides together with one of the non-interfaced pieces. And then we are going to stitch along the lower portion of that. Now, in order to reduce a bit of bulk, I like to go in and snip out the center as well as any of these corners here. It just makes it for a little bit easier for turning and getting a nice crisp corner on here. So I start off using my fingers and then I go in with my bone folder here and just get everything all pushed out, give it a nice good press. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do on this is we want to top stitch this. So we are going to add in the buttonholes right here and then top stitch. Now, I did add my buttonholes slightly lower than they should have been, so I would have moved them up just slightly. Next, let's attach these pockets to the front of our jacket. So on the pattern, transfer your markings and it will align the tops as well as the point of the pocket right here. And a trick I like to use is to put a quilting ruler underneath. This saves my table from getting scratched and allows me to easily put in the pins without moving my pocket. So I am going to use a generous amount of pins so that nothing shifts and then top stitch along the edge. And then we are going to add the flap. So I like to do the button up on the flap and place it where I want it to go and then pin it in place so I can get it stitched. That way I know everything is going to lie perfectly flat, especially if you made your buttonhole slightly lower than it should be like I did. Now for the jacket body. So with this, we are going to take our flaps here and we're going to stitch around the edges just to stay stitch that. Then we are going to place the front top and bottom right sides together and we are going to stitch this in place. And this is going to hide where that pocket flap seam is. So when we pull it up, it's nice and seamless right here, just like so. Let's do that for both sides. Next, we have our back. We want to create the pleat in the back. So we have the pleat going to either side. So these pleats are going in opposite directions facing the outside of the jacket. Then stitch that in place just to secure it. And then we're going to take the back bottom and the back top, place them right sides together and pin them in place to finish the back here for the exterior of our jacket. And once that is done, just give it a nice good stitch along here. And you can see I like to use washi tape when I have the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It makes it so much easier. So the next thing that you are going to want to do is attach them at the shoulder seams so that your front and back are together. Now for the collar. Now the collar piece here, we want to place them right sides together and you'll notice that we have the markings transferred onto the wrong side here. You would also want to transfer those inner markings along the center to the right side of one of the collar pieces because we'll need them later. So get that pinned and from the big dot to the big dot, go ahead and stitch that and then trim the corners just to remove some of that bulk. Then go ahead and flip it right side out. So as we look to do that, I like to get my point turner and get in those corners to get a nice crisp point on that collar. And once you have that done, go ahead and press it. So it's important that we are pressing this nicely because we are going to be doing some top stitching on this and we really want to make sure everything is lying nice and flat. If I can stress one thing, it is do not skip your pressing. It is so incredibly important. So go ahead and top stitch that as well as go across the back neck edge just to close everything up and to keep those two seams together. So I'm just using the edge of the presser foot for my top stitching on this, but you can really judge what you think looks best. And once again, if you wanted to use a contrasting top stitching thread, this would be where you would go and do that. So next, right here, I am just going within that seam allowance, which happens to be the edge of my presser foot, and attaching those two raw edges together so that they don't come apart. So that's what my collar looks like. Now we are going to attach it to the body of the jacket here. So you can see that I have stay stitched around the entire neck edge at that earlier step. And I'm just going to take my scissors and clip into that stay stitching. This allows that neck edge to stretch just a little bit more and fit that collar as it should. Now, remember those markings I told you to make on the exterior of the collar as well? Well, they match up to those shoulder seams. So I'm just going in here and I am finding the center of my collar. And so as I go and grab that center of my collar, I'm just going to make a quick mark right here, line my pattern piece up, and then match out those notches, and that notch where we started sewing should be right in the middle of our seam line here. So this allows me to really line everything up. So now I'm going to take that and I'm going to match it to that shoulder seam. So when it is matched up, I'm going to place my pin right in there. And then I am going to go ahead and just press those seams in the shoulders just to make it a little bit easier when we're putting this collar on. So I've matched up the two shoulder seams and then the center back, and then just distributing these pins going all along the sides here. And you should have a little bit of room at the front here where your collar doesn't come right to the edge. That is exactly as you want it because we have to put that front placket on anyway. So go ahead and stitch that in place so you can see the collar is stitched nicely in place here. Now for the lining. Now with the lining, you want to stay stitch those neck edges, so that should already be done, and then we're going to attach the shoulder seams. So I am just pinning it, and the lining is a lot thinner, so using a lightweight pin is ideal. So I am just stitching those shoulder seams, and I've pressed those seams flat to help reduce the bulk. Next, I am going to place my jacket right side up with my main fabric. And then I'm going to match up right sides together with the lining. So I'm going to match up those shoulder seams in the jacket with the shoulder seams in my lining and the center backs. And I am going to pin that in place. So we are going to go down and going all the way around that neckline edge. We're going to pin this in place. And once that is done, you can go ahead and just along this edge, go ahead and stitch it. So it should look like this, where we have this all stitched in place. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and iron it at this point. I tend to like to iron it at the end, but if you wanted to, you most certainly can. Next, we're going to use a burrito method to get the rest of the lining in. So roll up that front of your jacket and then take your lining piece and place it right sides together with the edge of that inside of your jacket, and make sure that nothing is twisted when you do that, and pin it in place. So it should look like this. I'm going to show you one more time a little bit more slowly on the other side. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the other side. So with the other side, we essentially want this to come directly to this seam where the pocket is. So we're going to flip it back to the right side. Go ahead and roll this side up, just like a burrito. That's where the name comes from. And then I am going to take this lining and put it right sides together with that seam that we had attached that the front of the jacket to. Add in your pins and then take it to the sewing machine and stitch it in place. So your little burrito rolls will look like this. You have your little burritos from the front of your jacket in between there. And then give it a nice good stitch. And this is what it is going to look like when it is all completed. So when it's all completed, you're just going to roll it out just like so. And you can see that those seams are fully encased. And we just have one more seam to go. So let's do the burrito method for the back seam here. It is done the exact same way. So flip it so that right side up is your jacket. And then go ahead and start to roll your burrito at the bottom of the jacket. So as it's coming in, you can see that this is the seam we want it to attach to. And then we are just going to bring that lining right over that, and it's the right side of the lining against this seam right here. And then we are just going to add enough pins inside here so that everything is held nicely in place, and the lining can be a little bit slippery. So I would suggest using more pins if you are feeling a little cautious about this. And then go ahead and stitch that. Should look like this. So let's open up that burrito. For this, we have to pull one whole side through to the other side, and voila, you have no exposed seams. Now this is when I like to give it a good press and really just flatten everything down. So going in here, paying careful attention to that placket piece area, going in on the shoulder seams, as well as using your pressing ham to get that nice curve within the collar so that it sits nice and flat and looks just so luxurious. So now that we have that, you can go ahead and top stitch both of those seams in place. This is optional, but I really like it. It also helps to secure that lining on the inside as well. And it really just helps to make your jacket last a little bit longer. Now for the sleeves. So with the sleeves, we do have 2 pleats at the cuff to help take in some of that fullness. Now both of these pleats are going to go towards that center front. So you can see they're both going in the same direction, and on that pattern piece, you've got your arrows depicting where they should go. So go ahead and pleat them using some pins, and then go ahead and stay stitch that just on your sewing machine like so. And now we need to attach those sleeves to our jacket. So I like to lay it with the right sides up. So we've got 2 notches on the back and 1 notch on the front. Find your sleeve with the 2 notches on the back and the 1 notch on the front that will fit right sides together with that. I like to match up the single and double notches first, then match up my center notch for the center of the sleeve, and then either end, and then just distribute the rest of that fabric in between. And I find that this really helps, and by insetting your sleeves in this way, it makes it so much easier to stitch up because you don't have to set in a sleeve. You're just treating this like any other seam. So I actually went ahead and serged this seam. You don't have to serge this seam, but if you want, you can. So the instructions don't tell you to do that because there's another finishing technique, which I'm going to show you right here. So you're going to press that seam towards the jacket, which in most instances, you're pressing the sleeve towards the sleeve, which is the way in which your arm would push that seam when you are putting on the jacket. But in this instance, we are going to top stitch that seam down. So we want to top stitch not on the sleeve, but on the jacket. So this is actually holding it down, and you can see that we have the seam right here. I'm just grabbing my duck-billed scissors and going in and trimming down any parts of the seam that are just slightly bigger than my top stitching so that everything looks nice and crisp and clean within the inside of my jacket so that it looks really, really nice. Now, if you wanted to, you could add extra seam allowances and do a flat felled seam, but this one is so much faster and so much easier. So you can see I'm just using the edge of my presser foot in line with how I did my pockets as well. And now for the inseam pockets. Now, in this instance, I'm going slightly out of order than the instructions. The instructions are going to have you stitch the side seam of the underarm sleeve going down to the top notch where you go to attach the pocket. It is much easier to attach the pocket pieces on first, so that's what we're going to do. Okay, so for the inseam pockets, you're going to have 4 pocket pieces. So what you're going to want to do is match them up between those notches. So you'll see that those notches are right there. So you're going to match them up and place them right sides together, ensuring that that pocket bag is pointing downwards. You don't want to have your pockets upside down. You won't be able to fit too much in there and you might lose some things. So go ahead and stitch those on and stitch them in place. I went ahead and serged that edge just to clear up any raw edges. Press it down and towards that seam, and then go ahead and understitch that seam so that your pocket lies nice and flat. Next, I am placing my jacket right sides together, and I'm going to stitch the entire underarm seam and side seam all at once. So let's get into that side seam here. So in this instance, I like to match up the underarm seam first, and then I'll go ahead and do the pocket, matching that up, paying careful attention to where that seam is lining up, and then pinning around the perimeter of the pocket and then going down your jacket and the sleeve here. And when that is all done, then you can go ahead and stitch that around the perimeter of the pocket. And I also like to serge that to finish those edges. But before you can serge it, go ahead and clip into the corners of that inseam pocket on either end. So see how I can stretch it out and it goes straight now? Then that makes it easier for you to serge. You'll have a little chain stitching right there, but it is not to worry because it is cut on the bias. Now for the sleeve cuffs. So with this, with the sleeves, do be sure to leave a portion at that notch open so that you can create that placket for the sleeves. So with this, because I serged it, I'm going to have to snip down. If you didn't serge it, you won't have to snip down because you can spread that seam allowance flat. But go ahead and just press out that seam allowance coming down and then fold in that seam allowance. So it's folded in half. This is going to be a very narrow hem and probably the trickiest portion of this jacket, but honestly, it is not that tricky. And I have some tips that can help you out. So the reason why it is tricky, it is starting and stopping that stitching. Sometimes your thread can get all jumbled up in the back of your sewing machine in the throat plate. But see this tissue paper? It's left over from tracing my pattern for this. I am just going to go on here. I'm going to insert my needle. Now, ideally, you don't backstitch. I did right here, but if you're really having troubles, only stitch forwards because that's also going to result in creating a bit more of that thread nest. But this tissue paper helps to stabilize your fabric and not suck that fabric into your feed dogs and allowing you to have a nice crisp seam along this placket. So once that's done, it should look just like so. And then you can just tear away that tissue paper and you've got your placket all ready to enter in the cuffs. So here are the cuffs. So with this, we are going to place them right sides together, and I like to iron it so that I have a good sense of where everything is and it lies quite nicely. Then you are going to go and choose just one side, and the side without the markings for the buttonhole and the button, fold under a top amount, and then you're going to stitch down, and it'll be the same amount as your seam allowance here. I'm just trimming these corners right here just to reduce any bulk, and then I'm going to flip my cuff right side out. So I am just using my point turner, getting it nice and crisp, and then going in and squaring up that cuff. And because we had folded the seam allowance, when we go to attach that cuff, make sure you attach the cuff with the buttonhole to the same side as the pleats that you made. Now, when you stitch this on, you will make sure that you line everything up. And because you've folded along that seam allowance, that means that when you stitch within that seam allowance, you are going to have a perfectly overhung cuff on the other side. So it should look like this once you've stitched it up. Fold it over to the right side like so, and then go ahead and grab your sleeve roll. I love to use a sleeve roll because it makes it a lot easier on these smaller pieces. Though it's not a curve per se, it is a tighter piece to iron, and I find it a lot easier to use that. You could use a rolled up towel if you don't have a sleeve roll or a pressing hem as well, which is a great free alternative. Press that seam up and then go ahead and press the cuff on here, just getting everything all nice and tidy. Now, the next thing that you want to do is you are going to want to take that overhang on the inside and you want to catch that. So we are going to stitch in the ditch. And what that means is we're going to stitch in between that seam line. So we want to make sure that where we're sticking the pin in is that seam line on the top, but it's also catching on the back like I just showed you. So when we have that, we're just going to continue to pin along here. And if you pin in this way, you will know that 100% of the time, if you are stitching on that top, if it is catching on the bottom, you're not going to have to go back and fix your stitches. So it should look like this. I went ahead and top stitched it as well, but that is totally optional for you. I also added in my button and a buttonhole. I always like to use a chisel to put in my buttonholes just because I find it a little less scary than using the seam ripper method that I was taught as a young girl. So we have the cuffs all completed. Our next step is the hem. So this is super simple. I decided to serge the bottom because it provides a perfect 1/4 inch border that I can use, but you totally do not have to do that. Once that is done, I like to fold it up the desired amount, and that would be the seam allowance, if I'm remembering correctly. And I'm just going to press that in place, and then I will top stitch that. So I've got that all top stitched. Now for the button placket. We're on the home stretch here. You can see that there are 2 notches at the top, and we want to fold the side that has not the 2 notches. So there is a side that you want to make sure that you are attaching. So next, you're going to take those 2 notches and you're going to match them up right sides together with the body of the jacket. So in this instance, we are going in and just spreading everything up and just making sure that we're matching those 2 notches and then just going all the way down. Now you will notice that the bottom is going to overhang the same amount as the seam allowance, as will the top. This is intentional. You want that placket to overhang because we need to finish the top and the bottom pieces. So you can see we have it all stitched on here, and now we are going to press it. Press that seam towards the button placket. So once that is done, I like to do it along the top as well. Then fold it in and make sure you're covering that seam ever so slightly because this will be stitched in the ditch as well. Pop in your pins, and then you are going to stitch right along that seam line so it is a nice seamless piece from that hem. Now we're going to do the exact same thing along the top. Now the top is a little bit more tricky because it is curved, but really not that tricky. So go ahead and fold it over as you did before, and then add your pins and stitch exactly along that same front line. So I just want to show you on the machine what that looks like. And in every instance, I am back stitching because we have to secure those stitches. Okay, so we have that all set. I am just using my point turner to get a nice crisp turn on here. And we've done that on both sides of the placket, so the right and the left side. Next, go ahead and press this down. And as you're pressing it down, make sure that that fold is just a couple millimeters over that seam line that you have. This will really help you out when you're doing this step. And this is the exact same pinning technique that we used when we did the cuffs. So as you're pinning in the ditch exactly where you are going to be stitching, make sure you are catching that back end and you will have a perfect seam every single time. So I've got that pinned in place, stitch in the ditch, and then you can also go ahead and top stitch this button placket. So I decided to top stitch mine just like so. So once that is all complete, next I'm going to use my button placket pattern piece to mark where my buttonholes are. So I'm just lifting it up above where the seam allowance is, and then I'm just adding this in. And I just realized that my blue chalk is not showing up very well on camera, so I'm going to use my white chalk right here. So I am just going in here. Now, if you wanted to adjust the number of buttons or your placement on that, just make sure that they are placed nice and evenly. So then go ahead and take your buttons, and on the one side, attach your buttons, and on the other side, your buttonholes. So I'm just going to show you how I love to attach my buttons, which is by machine because it is significantly faster than doing it by hand. And the back looks so much better. Most domestic machines do have this presser foot, and if you don't, you can also use just a standard zigzag stitch to do that as well. So we have it all complete and it is all stitched up and ready to wear. So are you guys ready for the reveal?
Let it go, what's the use in holding on? Can we find a way where we could spend some time alone? You know where to find me, you know which way to go. As long as you love me, we'll be singing all night long. So take a minute to hold me. I want nothing more than your arms and to be your baby tonight.
And there you go. You are all done your new Simplicity jean jacket. Now, if you have any questions at all, do let us know in the comments down below, and we are more than happy to help. As I mentioned before, everything is linked down below. And if you're not already a member here on Minerva, do be sure to create a free account. It's a great place for you to share all of your sewing and crafty makes. And if you're interested in seeing what I am up to here on Minerva, you can find me at Sheer Stitchery, and I'll link my profile down below. Until next time, makers.